Hello again, and I am back about to talk about the action potential and the refractory period. So let's get right to it. I'm going to go ahead and screen share. That's all right. Okay, action potential and refractory period. So first we'll get into the action potential, and I hope you remember what the resting potential was from last time, because it's going to be really important to describing the action potential. So let's remember that there are video links on here. If you open up the PowerPoint, you'll see those, and you can kind of go through some of the to review a little bit and see some of the things you might need to review before you go on. Okay, well, what is the action potential? The action potential is an electrical charge that's going to shoot down the axon, and it's going to be caused by a very rapid influx of sodium. Now, remember that sodium wants to come in. It badly wants to come into the neuron because there's an electrical gradient pushing it in. The inside of the neuron is negative. The outside is positive, so if they're attracted to each other. Sodium's on the outside, but it wants to come in through that electrical gradient, also wants to come in through the concentration gradient. So let's see what happens, how it eventually comes in and causes that action potential. Okay, well, it all starts with something called a depolarization. And there are a couple of different kinds of stimulation. So you can have a depolarization and a hyperpolarization. And depolarization will take you closer to an action potential. A hyperpolarization will take you away from an action potential. So first, let's talk about the depolarization. This is also called an EPSP, or an excitatory postsynaptic potential. So all that means is it's excitatory. It's going to take you closer to the action potential, but it's also postsynaptic, meaning it happens after the synapse, which is on the dendrite. Okay, so any kind of stimulation on the dendrite can cause this to happen, and it will cause a depolarization. Means that on the dendrite, channels for sodium open up a little bit. And when they open up a little bit, what's going to happen is some sodium is going to come in, because remember, the sodium was waiting outside the door like, let me in, let me in, let me in. And so once that, that window opens up, all of a sudden some sodium comes in. Now, depolarization can be strong or it can be weak. It's not yet an action potential, but if we get enough depolarization, it will be an action potential. We'll get to that in a second. We can also see something called hyperpolarization, and that's when, or inhibitory postsynaptic potential, and that is when the a neurotransmitter comes in that, or goes out for that matter, but something causes the inside of the neuron to become more negative rather than more positive. So this can happen in two ways. Either potassium leaves the neuron, or chloride starts coming in. And what's going to happen when we hyperpolarize is that we're getting away from the action potential. It's inhibiting the neuron. The neuron is going to be more likely to stay at rest. So the brain works through excitation and inhibition. So we'll see how those two kind of come together and cancel each other out sometimes in chapter 3. Okay, so let's look at a depolarization. So here where we start is -70 millivolts, and that is where the neuron is at rest. Now, if the neuron becomes depolarized, what happens is it becomes more positive. So you can see that line going up there, and the neuron has become more positive. But you see this -50 up here. This is what we call threshold. It didn't quite make it to threshold in this time, but it was a slight positive, right? And then you can notice it goes right back down to the -70, and it kind of stays at the -70. So, excuse me. Here's the hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization, again, it starts at -70, and then let's say some potassium leaves or chloride comes in, and so you get a greater negativity, and that we call hyperpolarization. It's becoming more polarized, hyper meaning more different than the outside of the neuron. So we have a slight hyperpolarization there, and then we get back to -70 like we were. Okay. So depolarization, or an EPSP, will take the neuron closer to threshold. So what happens when the neuron reaches that threshold? Well, when a depolarization gets up to the level of the threshold, if it hits that line of threshold, it gets positive enough, what's going to happen is that there are some what we call voltage activated gates for sodium, and they're going to be at the axon hillock. That's at the very top of the axon. And so these voltage activated gates, they respond to that threshold level, and they open up, and they kind of fly open, and they're huge gates. So now all that sodium on the outside just starts rushing in like crazy. And we start to get then this electrical charge that starts coming down the axon. Now, that electrical charge is going to go all the way down the axon, and it's going to maintain the same strength all the way down the axon. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But the fact that it remains the same strength all the way down the axon is called the all or none law. When you hit threshold, you're going to get a all the way down the axon. And it's going to be the same no matter what. As long as you hit threshold, it's not like you get a strong action potential or a weak action potential. It's always exactly the same as long as you hit threshold. Okay. All right, so here let's take a look at it on the graph again. You see we're at -70, which is the, we start out at -70 on that red line, and then we get a depolarization that takes us up at this point above the threshold. The threshold changes from neuron to neuron, so don't worry too much about the number there, but it's around -50, -40, -50. We hit a threshold there. Now the sodium gates at the axon hillock fly open, and all that sodium coming in is going to cause a rapid spike in the positivity of the neuron. And then notice almost as quickly that neuron comes back down and becomes hyperpolarized again, slightly hyperpolarized at the end there. And so we're going to get a rapid depolarization from all of that sodium coming in. Okay, and again, watch that video if you'd like to review. So how does the action potential actually travel down the axon? So now we're looking at it. It starts in that axon hillock. We said all the sodium gates open, sodium comes rushing in. How does it travel down the axon? Remember those little things called the nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier are those little breaks in the myelin sheath. And at each one of those, there are sodium channels. So sodium gates at each one of those nodes of Ranvier can open. What will happen is, starts in the axon hillock, here comes the charge, the sodium rushing down the axon. It gets to the next node of Ranvier, and then the gates open there. More sodium rushes in, down to the next node of Ranvier. Now the gates open there, more sodium rushes in. So it's kind of like a series of action potentials that goes all the way down the axon. It jumps to the next set of gates at the next nodes, and then it jumps to the next set of gates, and then it jumps to the next set of gates. And of course, this is all happening super rapidly. So what we call this is kind of jumping conduction down the neuron, electrical conduction. We call that saltatory conduction. And for any of you guys who know Spanish, you'll know that saltar is the verb for to jump. So that means a jumping conduction down the axon. So the charge is going to jump down to the next set of sodium channels, again, on the nodes of Ranvier. I want to mention again that I talked about multiple sclerosis in the very beginning when I talked about myelin, because as the myelin degenerates in multiple sclerosis, we see the loss of a charge coming down the axon. And that is because the charge can't make it to the next node because it needs that myelin to be able to insulate it. Okay, so here we see in a diagram, the charge is going to start right here. It jumps down here. It jumps down here. It jumps down here. Each one of these nodes kind of regenerates the charge. We get a depolarization that happens all over again at each node, all the way down the axon. And so there you see those positive charges coming in. Those are sodium in every case. Okay, so that's saltatory conduction. So I want you to now pause the video and develop a simple list of steps in that action potential, starting with the depolarization and getting all the way down to the end of the axon, get through saltatory conduction and what's happening with those sodium gates. So do that in your own words. Stop the video and see if you can do that. Test yourself. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this refractory period. After the action potential, what we see is that the neuron cannot fire right away. And so the refractory period means that the neuron is having trouble firing right away. Well, remember, we get a spike up in the positivity and then it goes way down. Once it's at that down point, you can't fire that neuron again right away. It's got to kind of reset. It's got to hit the reset button there at the bottom. And we'll talk about that. What is that reset button? It's called, hint, the sodium potassium pump, which we've talked about before. So remember, the sodium potassium pump is going to kick out 3 sodiums and take in 2 potassiums. Okay, so there's an absolute refractory period and a relative refractory period. Absolute is just what it says. That neuron cannot fire no matter how much stimulation you give it. You can depolarize the hell out of it and it's not going to fire. The relative refractory period is when the neuron will fire as long as it's given a huge depolarization. So what that does is kind of ups the threshold a little bit. Okay, and with that, I am finished with chapter 1. So please review, watch the videos, read the text before you take on that exam for chapter 1. I'm here to help, so please do use me if you need to. My phone number, my email, any way you want to contact me is good. Hope you enjoyed the video.